She was not supposed to be here. That was the first thing Lyra told herself every morning when she woke in the small stone room at the east end of the royal healer's wing. Not a servant's quarters, not a noblewoman's chamber. Something caught uncomfortably between the two. She had been placed here 6 days ago without being asked. A royal guard had appeared at her cottage door in the village of Ashford, presented her with a sealed letter bearing the black wax impression of the Blackmere crest, and waited in complete silence while she read the words inside. The words had been few. They always were when they came from a king. Your presence is required at the palace of Vidoria. You will report to the royal healer's wing. You will not discuss the nature of your summons with anyone. She had packed one bag. She had not known what else to do. That had been 6 days ago. In those 6 days, she had treated a council lord's gout, reset a broken finger belonging to a palace guardsman who had been too embarrassed to report it for a week, and delivered a tincture for the severe headaches of the king's second secretary, a woman named Dessa, who had looked at Lyra with an expression of such unguarded relief that something in Lyra's chest had twisted painfully. She had not seen the king. She had felt him, though. That was the part she did not know how to explain, not to herself, not to anyone. On the second evening, something had shifted in her chest, a low, resonant hum, like a bowstring plucked in a room with very good acoustics. She had stopped walking mid-step in the servants' corridor, one hand pressed flat against the stone wall, waiting for it to pass. It had not passed. It had deepened, spread outward from her sternum to her ribs to the tips of her fingers, and then it had pulled, subtly, undeniably, in the direction of the throne room. She had walked firmly in the opposite direction and told herself she needed sleep. On the third morning, she had smelled him before she heard him. That was impossible. She knew it was impossible. She was halfway down a corridor that ran parallel to the royal library, carrying a cedar box of dried elderflower, when the scent hit her like something physical. Dark leather and winter wind and something underneath that she had no name for. Something that felt like the space just before lightning strikes. Her heart had thrown itself against her ribs. Her feet had stopped entirely. She had stood there in that corridor with her cedar box pressed to her chest and waited, trembling slightly, for whatever was about to happen. Nothing had happened. The corridor had remained empty. The scent had faded. She had spent the rest of that morning convincing herself that the palace simply had unusual ventilation. By the 5th day, she had stopped pretending. She knew what it was. She was a healer. She knew the old texts, the ones most healers kept hidden at the bottoms of their cedar boxes beneath the elderflower and wolfsbane. She knew about fated mates. She knew about the bond that formed without permission, without consent, without any regard whatsoever for whether the timing was catastrophically inconvenient. She knew that it started as whispers and became a roar, that it began in the chest and migrated to the blood, that it rewired the body's instincts at a level deeper than thought or reason. She also knew who the Alpha King of Vidoria was. Kaelin Blackmere, carved from shadow and silver, according to every account she had ever encountered. Features sharp enough to cut, eyes the pale gold of a winter moon, most powerful wolf in the realm, ruled from the iron throne of Moonstone with a voice of command that could silence 500 wolves without being raised above a conversational register, had ended 3 wars in 7 years, had never, in the history of his reign, chosen a mate. Lyra was a village healer from Ashford. Her mother had been a village healer from Ashford before her. She owned 2 decent dresses, a cedar box of remedies, and a very small but deeply practical collection of texts that she kept hidden from the wolf nobility who occasionally visited the village and tended to look at her healing magic with the particular expression of barely contained hostility that the powerful reserved for the useful but unnatural. She was nobody. The mate bond, apparently, had not consulted anyone on this point. On the morning of the 6th day, she was in the small treatment room at the end of the corridor, grinding dried moon petal into powder for a pain tincture, when the door opened without a knock. She had learned in 6 days at this palace that doors opened without knocks when the person on the other side was either very important or very rude. She had set down her grinding stone, squared her shoulders, and turned around. The man in the doorway was not what she had expected. She had expected a messenger. She had expected another council lord with gout. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, to continue indefinitely in this strange, suspended state. Summoned, but not spoken to. Present, but not seen. Until someone decided she was no longer required and sent her back to Ashford. She had not expected Kalen Blackmere standing in the doorway of the healer's treatment room with his dark hair falling across his forehead and his pale gold eyes doing something she had no word for. Something that was not quite recognition, but was not nothing either. She had also not expected the way the bond detonated in her chest the moment their eyes met. It was not a hum now. It was not a pull. It was fire, absolute and total, racing through her veins from her sternum outward, lighting her up from the inside like a lantern with a flame too large for its glass. Her hands gripped the edge of the treatment table behind her. She held on to it because she needed something to hold on to. His nostrils flared. She watched it happen. The subtle expansion of awareness, the way his entire body went momentarily, perfectly still. The way those gold eyes darkened at their edges as something ancient and involuntary moved behind them. A muscle in his jaw worked. His hands, she noticed them, broad and scarred and dangerously still. Fisted once at his sides and released. She said, because someone had to say something, "You knocked." He looked at her. The weight of it pressed against her skin like a hand. "I did not. You opened the door without knocking." "It is my palace." "It is your healer's treatment room," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect, given that fire was still racing through her blood and her fingers had gone white on the edge of the table. "People come here when they are hurt. Knocking exists, so they are not frightened." He was quiet for a moment that pressed and pressed and pressed. "Are you hurt?" he said. The question landed wrong, off rhythm, like it had surprised him as much as it surprised her. Like he had meant to say something else entirely, and something had rerouted it. "No," she said. "Are you frightened?" She looked at him steadily. "Should I be? Most people are." "I am a healer," she said. "I stopped being frightened of things I can't fix some time ago. Frightened doesn't help. Frightened gets in the way." Something moved across his face. It was there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Not quite a smile, nothing so accessible as a smile, but something in the same family. Something that acknowledged her without surrendering anything. "Lyra of Ashford," he said. Her name in his mouth felt like a key in a lock, low and rough, resonating through her chest like the bond had found a new register to vibrate at. "You have been in my palace for 6 days. "I have." "No one has spoken to you about why." "No." That was not intentional. He moved into the room then, 2 steps, no more, and stopped at a careful distance that she recognized immediately as deliberate. He was controlling the proximity. He was doing it for her, The recognition of that sat strangely in her chest alongside the fire. I was informed of your arrival. I intended to speak with you that evening. There were complications. There usually are when you're a king. You are not frightened of me, he said again, and this time it wasn't a question. I told you, frightened doesn't help. Most people manage it regardless of whether it helps. I'm not most people. The silence this time was different. It had a texture to it, the texture of something being decided, something being turned over and examined and set down carefully. She watched him do it. She watched him stand there in the center of her treatment room with the weight of an entire kingdom settled across his shoulders like armor, and she thought, very clearly, that she had never in her life seen anyone more alone. No, he said finally, and his voice had dropped to something quieter, something that she suspected was not a register he used often. You are not. He did not stay long that first time. He asked her about the patients she had treated. He asked whether she had been provided everything she needed. He asked, with a precision that told her he already knew the answer, whether the palace healers had treated her with appropriate respect. She answered all of these questions honestly. She asked no questions of her own. He left without telling her why she was there. She stood in the treatment room for a long time afterward, one hand pressed flat against her sternum, feeling the bond settle from fire back to that low, resonant hum. It was different now, though. Deeper, more specific. It knew him now in a way it hadn't before. It had a direction. She told herself firmly that this was extremely inconvenient. She spent the next 2 days learning the rhythms of the palace, where the council lords walked, what hours the main corridor was crowded and what hours it was empty. She was not hiding, she told herself. She was being sensible. She was a village healer with uncommon healing magic in a palace full of wolf nobility who considered uncommon healing magic in the same category as a rat infestation. Not immediately dangerous, but deeply undesirable and best dealt with quickly. She was also, apparently, the fated mate of the Alpha King of Vidoria, which she had decided to treat as a private fact in the same way she treated most facts that she could not immediately do anything about. She filed it carefully in the part of her mind reserved for things she was aware of, but not yet acting on. She did her work. She treated her patients. She slept when she could. She dreamed of gold eyes and a voice like thunder heard from the inside of a room, resonating through walls. On the 8th day, she met Lord Aldrich Thorne. He arrived in the healer's wing during the noon hour, and he was not there for treatment. She knew this because he stood in the doorway of the treatment room without entering it and looked at her with the particular expression of barely concealed disdain that she had, by now, become very familiar with. His lip curled at one corner. His eyes moved over her in the manner of someone cataloging a problem. You are the healer from Ashford, he said. I am. Common blood. She set down the tincture she was measuring. I beg your pardon? Your healing magic. Common blood magic. He said it as he might have said vermin in the grain stores, matter-of-factly, as though the distaste was simply accurate description. We have royal healers in this palace, trained practitioners from noble lines. The king does not require a village witch with borrowed light. She was aware, distantly, of her hands going still on the treatment table. She was aware of the tincture she had been measuring, of the careful work of the last hour, of the fact that she was in this palace because a letter had arrived, and she had come, and she had done nothing wrong. The king's summons said otherwise, she said. The king was misinformed. Lord Thorne's voice dripped with the specific satisfaction of a man delivering bad news he has curated carefully. The situation has been clarified. You will find, if you check the entrance hall, that your belongings have been packed. You will be escorted from the palace grounds before sunset. A horse has been arranged. She looked at him for a very long moment. The king, she said carefully, sent for me himself. The king's advisors have reviewed the matter and determined that your presence here represents an inappropriate use of resources and a potential disruption to the courts established. Has the king agreed with this determination? Lord Thorne's lip curled further. The king has been informed, which was not the same thing, she noted. Not even slightly the same thing. But she was a village healer, standing in a palace where she had no allies and no standing. And the man in front of her represented the kind of institutional authority that could make her life considerably more difficult than it already was. She knew when a battle was not one she could win. She pressed her lips together. I'll collect my things, she said. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that every instinct in her body, trained healer's instincts, 11 years of reading people who were trying to tell her one thing with their mouths while their bodies screamed something else entirely, was telling her that Lord Thorne was afraid of something. That the disdain was real, but the urgency beneath it was even realer. That he had moved quickly while the king was occupied, while advisors had access and the object of concern did not. She did not say any of this. She packed her cedar box. She collected her 2 dresses, her texts, the small carved wooden figure her mother had given her the year she turned 12. She carried her bag to the entrance hall, accepted the scroll of dismissal from the guard who offered it without meeting her eyes, and walked through the palace's main gates into the long evening light of an autumn afternoon in Vidoria. The horse they had arranged was a serviceable gray. Not an insult, but not a compliment either. She rode it to the first inn on the road to Ashford, took a room, and sat on the narrow bed for a long time in the gathering dark. The bond burned in her chest like a coal pressed against skin. It was not fading. She had half expected it to, had half hoped it would, when there was enough physical distance between them. But it was doing nothing of the kind. It was precisely the opposite of fading. It had found a direction, and it was pulling, specific and insistent, back toward the palace, back toward the palace gates, back toward the man who did not yet know what had happened to her this afternoon. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum. I know, she said quietly, to no one and nothing, and the bond that was not a person, but felt like it was trying to tell her something. I know. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark of the inn room with the bond pulling and burning, and she thought about Lord Thorne's face, and the speed with which her belongings had been packed, and the specific phrasing he had used. The king has been informed. And she thought about what a man like that was afraid of. And she thought about the way Caelan Blackmere had stood in the doorway of the treatment room with his gold eyes doing something she had no name for. And she thought, against everything sensible in her, that she should not have left. Not because she wanted to stay, not because of the bond, because something was wrong. Because healers learned to recognize when wrong had been done to someone, and Lord Thorne's urgent, satisfied face had been the face of someone doing wrong quickly before the person with the authority to stop him became aware of it. She sat up in the dark. She put on her shoes. She was going to regret this, she told herself, with the particular certainty of a person about to do something they have already decided to do. She went back. The palace at midnight looked different than it did by day. All shadow and silver. The moonstone set into the main gates, pulsing with faint light. the great stone walls absorbing the darkness around them, like something that had been built specifically to contain it. The guards at the east gate were surprised to see her. She could see it in the brief flicker of their eyes before discipline reasserted itself. "The healer from Ashford," the senior guard said. He was young, perhaps 25, and his eyes were doing something complicated. "You were dismissed this afternoon." "I was told to leave," she said. "I've returned. I need to speak with the king." "The king is not receiving—" "I need to speak with him," she said again, steadily. "I understand that it's midnight. I understand that I was dismissed. I need to speak with him anyway. You can hold me at the gate while you send a messenger, or you can let me stand in the entrance hall while you send a messenger. But I am asking you to send one." The senior guard looked at her for a long, measuring moment. She looked back. Something in what he saw apparently decided him, because he turned to the younger guard and said something brief and quiet, and the younger guard disappeared at a pace that was almost a run. She waited. The entrance hall was cold at this hour, the black marble floors radiating the memory of the day's chill, the silver filigree walls catching moonlight through the high, narrow windows. She stood in the center of it, with her bag over one shoulder and her cedar box in both hands, and she waited, and she did not let herself think too carefully about what she was doing, or she would stop. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps on the stair above, not one set, but two, moving fast, and the specific quality of the sound told her everything about the person making it before they came into view. Controlled force, economy of movement, nothing wasted. Kalen Blackmere came down the staircase 2 steps at a time. He was in black trousers and a white shirt open at the collar, and he was no less dangerous for it, not even slightly. His dark hair was pushed back from his face like someone who had been awake for hours. His gold eyes found her immediately in the entrance hall, from across 40 feet of black marble, with an accuracy that sent the bond in her chest surging from coal to fire in the space of a single heartbeat. He stopped at the base of the stairs. Behind him, at a careful distance, his first beta. Silver-streaked dark hair, weathered face, kind eyes behind the sharp angles of a man who had spent decades watching a king be powerful and had somehow remained inexplicably decent, stopped as well. "You were dismissed," Kalen said. His voice was low and rough and resonating through the entrance hall's high ceilings in a way that did something complicated to the air. "I was," she said. "Who dismissed you?" "Lord Aldrich Thorne." The silence that followed this had a temperature. It was several degrees below the cold of the marble floor. "Lord Thorne," he said, "does not have the authority to dismiss people I have summoned." He seemed to believe he did. He was mistaken. She looked at him steadily. The bond was doing extraordinary things. She was doing her best to stand in it the way she stood in strong wind, not fighting it, not yielding to it, simply acknowledging the force of it and remaining upright. "He was also afraid," she said. "Lord Thorne, he moved quickly, before you could be consulted. That kind of speed, in a man like that, comes from fear. Whatever he was afraid of, it was urgent enough that he sent me away on the same day you had." She stopped, reorganized. "On the same day, things changed." He was very still. "Things changed," he repeated, and his voice had dropped to something that she felt in her sternum rather than her ears. "Between the first morning I arrived and the 8th day," she said, "something changed. You came to the treatment room. You know what I am, Your Majesty. You know what you felt when you walked in there, and I know what I felt. And Lord Thorne apparently also knows, because whatever frightened him was urgent enough that he needed me gone before sunrise." The beta behind him made a sound. It was very controlled. It was the sound of a man exercising an extraordinary amount of restraint on a reaction that very much wanted to be louder. Kaylin took 2 steps toward her. He stopped at a distance that was closer than before, closer than the careful, deliberate distance he had maintained in the treatment room. And she had to work harder to hold still, to keep her breathing even, to keep the bond from doing something she would not be able to explain. "You came back," he said. "I did." "You rode back through the dark, alone, to a palace that had dismissed you, because you thought something was wrong." "Something was wrong," she said. "I didn't think it. I knew it." "You had every reason to go home?" "I had every reason not to." She held his gaze. "You summoned me for a reason. I don't know yet what that reason is beyond the obvious. But I know you didn't summon me so that a council lord could pack my bag and arrange a horse while you were occupied elsewhere. Whatever you need from me, you haven't had the chance to tell me yet. It seemed worth coming back for." Something moved across his face. Not the almost smile from the treatment room. Something more than that. Something that was in the vicinity of devastated, which she had not expected, which landed in her chest like a stone into still water. "You are very strange," he said. "I've been told. Most people, if sent away from this palace, would not return." "Most people," she said, "were not summoned here by their fated mate." The word sat in the air between them. She watched him hold absolutely, completely still with it. She watched the bond in his chest do the same thing it was doing in hers. She could feel it, distantly, through that invisible thread that had been growing between them all week, a reflection of the fire she was carrying, exact and mirrored. "Lyra," he said, and her name in his mouth was still a key in a lock, still low and rough, still resonating, but different now, heavy with something. "I know what it is," she said quietly. "I've read the texts. I know what this means, and I know what it doesn't mean, and I know that you don't owe me anything beyond the truth, which I'm asking you for. I came back because whatever is happening regardless of whether I'm here or in Ashford, and I would rather be here where I can see it clearly." He looked at her for a long time. Behind him, his beta had gone very carefully still, in the manner of someone trying to be furniture. "You will have the truth," Kaylin said finally. "All of it. Tomorrow morning, when it is light, and when Lord Thorn can be summoned to account for what he did today." His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. The specific temperature of it, when he said Lord Thorn's name, was accounting enough. "Tonight, you will return to your room in the healer's wing." "You're not sending me away again." "I am not sending you away." He said it as though it was a fact of the world he was clarifying, rather than a decision he was making. "I sent for you because I need you here. I made the error of not explaining that clearly enough, and Lord Thorn used the space that error created. That will not happen again." She studied him. 11 years of reading patients had given her a very specific ability to distinguish between what people said and what they meant, and what Kaylin Blackmere meant, she thought, was exactly what he had said. Not a performance, not a strategy. He had made a mistake, and he was acknowledging it without dressing it up. She did not know what to do with that. She had expected to have to argue harder. "All right," she said. She let one of the guards carry her bag. She carried her cedar box herself. She walked back through the palace she had left 3 hours ago, with a different feeling in her chest than the one that had driven her out of the inn room and back onto the gray horse. It was not easier, exactly. It was not safer. But it was clearer. She slept finally, and she dreamed of the bond humming between them like a live wire strung across a dark room, and she thought, even in sleep, that it felt like something inevitable settling into its proper shape. She did not dream of being afraid. The next morning came early, cold and sharp, and the breakfast that appeared on the small table in her room was considerably more elaborate than anything the palace had seen fit to provide in the first 8 days. She noted this without comment. She ate, methodically, and she read, and she waited. The summons to the council chamber came at the 7th hour. She had been told, she realized, nothing about what to expect. She had been told she would have the truth. She had not been told that having the truth would mean standing in a circular room with black marble floors and silver veins and a crescent table with 7 seats, all currently occupied by men who looked at her the way Lord Thorn had looked at her the previous afternoon, with the specific expression of people confronting a problem they would prefer not to have. Lord Thorn himself sat at the 3rd seat to the left. His face was the face of a man who had gone to sleep believing he had handled a situation and woken up to discover he had not. Kaelin sat at the head of the crescent. He was in full court dress, and she understood for the first time, seeing him here in this context, exactly what carved from shadow and silver meant. He was not performing power. He simply had it, the way certain mountains simply had height. She stood. She had learned in 11 years as a healer that the person who was standing when everyone else was seated had 2 options: feel small or take up the space deliberately. She chose the second. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and her chin level, and she waited for whatever was about to happen. "Lord Thorn," Kaelin said. His voice was perfectly even. "Yesterday afternoon, in my absence, you dismissed the healer from Ashford from the palace grounds and arranged for her transport. You told her that the king had been informed." Lord Thorn's chin rose. "I acted in the court's best interest. Had I agreed with your decision?" Silence. Had I been consulted? The situation was, "Had I agreed?" Kaelin said, and the evenness of his voice was more dangerous than anything louder would have been. "With your decision?" Lord Thorn's jaw set. "No." "No?" He let the word sit. "You used my absence and my delay to remove from this palace a person I had summoned, without my knowledge or consent, because you were afraid of what her presence here meant. Because you understood, correctly, what she is to me, and you believed that acting quickly enough would allow you to present me with an outcome I could not reverse." One of the other council lords shifted in his chair. He had copper hair and calculating eyes, and he was doing calculations very quickly. "Your Majesty," Lord Thorn said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man attempting to find solid ground under rapidly shifting sand. "The healer is common-blooded. Her presence in the palace will be seen as, she is my fated mate." The words hit the room like a stone wall hitting the ground. She felt the bond surge in her chest. She felt, through it, the force with which he had said them, not performed, not strategic, just stated, the way he stated things, as facts of the world rather than claims to be argued. Lord Thorn's face went still. "The moon chose her," Kaelin said, and the chill had not left his voice, not even slightly. "Not the council, not the bloodline traditions of House Thorn. The moon. If you have objections to the moon's choices, Lord Thorn, I encourage you to direct them to her personally. In the meantime, you will understand that the healer from Ashford is under my protection, and any further interference with her presence in this palace will be treated as interference with me." The calculating man with copper hair had finished his calculations. He was looking at Lyra now with an entirely different expression. Not disdain, not hostility, but the particular considered assessment of someone revising their position based on new information. She had seen this face before. It was the face of the practical. Lord Thorne's face was the face of the not yet finished. "The council has the right," he said, controlled, "to discuss matters pertaining to the royal succession." "Then discuss them," Kaelin said, "with me, to my face, when I am present." He looked at Lord Thorne for a moment that she suspected Lord Thorne would remember for some time. "Do not move pieces while the king is not watching and expect him not to notice. I notice everything." She believed him completely. The council meeting ended with the particular atmosphere of a fire that has been smothered, but is still hot beneath the ash. She walked out of the circular room into the corridor beyond it, and she stood there for a moment with her hands at her sides and her heart doing something complicated. Footsteps behind her. She turned. Kaelin had followed her out. He had not followed any of the council lords. He had followed her, and he was standing in the corridor with that particular stillness of his. The stillness that she was beginning to understand was not absence of feeling, but its containment. Everything held in check by an enormous act of deliberate will. "You should have been told all of this before you were placed in a position to need it," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I will not make that mistake again." "Good." He looked at her. The gold eyes had something in them now that was harder to name than recognition, harder to name than the heat of the bond. Something that she thought, with the particular clear-eyed assessment of someone who spent their days looking honestly at what was in front of them, might be wonder. "You are very calm," he said. "I told you, frightened doesn't help." "You were just publicly declared the fated mate of the Alpha King of Vidoria in front of his 7 council lords, several of whom would prefer you did not exist." "I was aware of all of that while it was happening." "And?" She considered it honestly. "And it's true," she said. "All of it. The bond is real. What I felt when you walked into the treatment room was real. Lord Thorne's fear is real, and he's not done being afraid, which means he's not done causing problems. What would being frightened help with in any of those categories?" He was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing," she agreed. She went back to the healer's wing. She treated a guardsman's sprained wrist and a council lord's wife's persistent cough, and she ground more moon petal into tincture, and she worked steadily through the morning, and she thought about what she had started and where it was going to lead, and whether she was, in fact, as calm as she appeared to be. She was not entirely as calm as she appeared to be, but she was, underneath the not calm, clear. And clear was more useful. The days that followed built a rhythm that she had not expected. He came to the treatment room each morning, not taking treatment, simply arriving, sitting in the wooden chair across the table from where she worked, asking questions. Not small questions. Not the questions of courtesy or diplomatic interest that she would have expected. Real questions about Ashford, about how she had learned her craft, about what she thought the bond meant, and what she thought it did not mean, and whether she was afraid, and what she thought the council would do next. She answered honestly. She asked her own questions in return. He answered them. On the 4th morning of this, she asked him how long he had known. He was quiet for a moment that stretched and stretched. "From the day you arrived," he said. "I was told a healer had come from Ashford. I was in the throne room. From across the palace, I felt something. A shift in the air, a change in pressure. Something that I could not explain except that I knew, the way a wolf knows, that something fundamental had changed." He looked at his hands. "I told myself it was a coincidence, that the bond was a legend." "You're a wolf. How could you believe that?" because believing it meant accepting what it implied. He looked at her, and what it implied was terrifying. She looked at him. This man who commanded armies, who ended wars, who silenced 500 wolves with a word, and she saw, very clearly, the place where the power ended and the person began. "You thought I would leave," she said. "I thought you would be afraid." "I told you." "I know what you told me." Something crossed his face. But knowing something in theory and trusting it in practice are not the same thing. I have spent every year of my reign learning that things end. Alliances fracture, treaties break, people who should stay leave. He paused. "I was slow because I was afraid that if I moved too quickly, I would frighten you away, and the version of that I most dreaded was that you would be gone before I had the chance to—" He stopped. She waited. "Before I had the chance to be something worth staying for," he said. The bond in her chest hummed like a struck bell. She stood up from her side of the table. She walked around it, and she sat in the chair beside his instead, and she looked at him at close range, and she said, very honestly, "That was very hard to say." "Yes," he said. "I know," she said. "Thank you." He looked at her with those gold eyes, and something in his face shifted into something she thought might be the most dangerous thing he had ever done. Not the armies, not the ended wars, not the Iron Throne, just this, just allowing himself to be seen. "I have commanded armies," he said quietly. "I have ended wars. I have sat on that throne for 11 years. I do not know how to—" He stopped, started again. "I do not know how to be a mate. I have no template for it. My parents' bond was political. What I was taught about the mate bond was all authority and possession and the mechanics of claiming. Nobody taught me how to—" Another stop. "How to make someone want to stay." She thought about this very carefully before she spoke. "I already want to stay," she said. "I rode back through the dark to be here. That wasn't the bond. The bond was the reason I came in the first place, but the reason I came back was because something was wrong and I couldn't leave it wrong. I stay when things matter. You matter." She looked at him directly. "I don't know yet everything that means. Neither do you. But I'm not going anywhere, and not because of the bond, because I'm choosing it." He was very still. "Lyra," he said, and her name in his mouth had moved past key and lock to something else now, something that felt like the word before the last word, like the breath before the sentence. "Yes," she said. He reached out, very slowly, and his hand covered hers on the arm of the chair. The heat of it was not the violent fire of the first recognition, but something steadier and deeper. The heat of something that had decided to stay. His hand was broad and scarred and alive with warmth, and she felt the bond settle into it like a thread finding its anchor. She did not pull away. She sat beside him in the healer's treatment room, with the morning light coming through the high, narrow windows and the bond humming steadily between them, and she thought, clearly and without flinching, that she had absolutely no idea what came next. She also thought that she was not afraid. What came next, as it turned out, was Lord Thorn. Not Lord Thorn himself, but the shape of Lord Thorn's fear given form and direction, a formal petition, presented before the full Council of 7 3 days later, challenging the legitimacy of an unchosen mate, a common-blooded healer with no house standing, no wolf blood in her lineage, no ancestral claim to any territory or title that would make her a suitable queen of Vidoria. She was told about the petition by the beta. Brennan, she had learned his name by now, silver-streaked and weathered, and possessed of eyes that were considerably kinder than his angles suggested, who arrived at the treatment room door at the second hour of the evening and delivered the news with the specific expression of a man who has practiced delivering bad news so many times that he can do it cleanly but cannot make it not bad. "He will answer it," Brennan said when she had finished reading the petition's summary. "He will answer it tomorrow, and it will not go Lord Thorne's way. I want you to know that." "I know," she said. "Do you?" He studied her with those kind eyes. "Because you've been here 11 days, and you've already been thrown out of the palace once, and had your legitimacy formally challenged before the council. And in my experience, that combination of things tends to—" "Brennan," she said. "Yes." "Do you trust him?" He was quiet for a moment. "With my life." "Then that's enough." She set the petition summary down on the table. "He's not going to make this easy for me. I know that. Whatever I am to him personally, the political reality of what I am is going to keep being a problem that people like Lord Thorne will keep trying to solve by removing me. I'm aware of all of that." Brennan looked at her for a long moment. "He asked me to check on you," he said. "That's what he told me. He said, 'Go to the healer's wing and see that she has everything she needs.'" A slight shift in his expression that she was beginning to recognize as his version of a smile. "He did not say, 'Tell her I can't stop thinking about her,' but I have worked for him for 19 years, and the way someone speaks when they're trying to say something they cannot say is very recognizable when you've heard it long enough." She looked at him. "He's been awake," Brennan said simply. "Since the bond, genuinely asleep for perhaps an hour a night. The rest of the time Another slight pause. "He finds himself outside the east corridor, near the healer's wing, every night well before sunrise. He turns around before he knocks. But he gets there every time." The bond hummed in her chest like recognition. "Every night?" she said. "Every night." She thought about this for a moment. She thought about what it meant, not the politics of it, not the implications, just the image of it. The most powerful wolf in the realm, in the dark hours before sunrise, standing in a corridor outside a healer's door because his wolf had brought him there before his mind had fully agreed to it. Turning around every time, because he was trying to be worth staying for before he asked for anything. Something in her chest cracked open, not the bond, not the heat, something older and quieter than both of those. Something that felt like the last wall going down. "Tell him," she said, "that he doesn't have to turn around." Brennan looked at her with those kind eyes for a moment. "I'll tell him," he said. She did not sleep well that night. Not from fear, not from dread, but from the particular wakeful quality of waiting for something she had decided she wanted. She lay in the dark of the healer's room and she listened to the palace settle around her, the stone breathing in the cold, the distant sound of the night guard circuit, the silence beyond it. She heard the footsteps at the third hour. Slow, even, controlled, but present. Not turning around this time. She sat up in the dark and she listened to them come to a stop just outside her door, and she waited, and there was a moment of perfect silence that pressed against the wood between them like a held breath. Then a knock, quiet, deliberate. She got up. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. She crossed the room in bare feet on cold stone, and she opened the door. He was standing in the corridor in black and white, no armor, no court dress, just himself. And she had thought she understood by now the difference between the king and the man. She had not. Standing in the corridor at the third hour before sunrise with his dark hair falling across his forehead, and his gold eyes carrying everything he had not said in 11 days. He was simply a person who had walked through the dark to stand outside a door because some part of him, older and more honest than all the power he carried, had refused to let him stay away any longer. "I know I should have waited until morning," he said. "You should have knocked 3 nights ago," she said. Something moved across his face that was not almost a smile. It was the real thing, brief and devastating, and entirely for her. "I was trying," he said, "to give you time." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "I don't need more time, Kaylin." His name in her mouth changed the air between them. She watched it land, watched the gold eyes darken, watched his hands still at his sides, watched the careful control he maintained over himself, register the sound of it, and then, slowly, begin to come undone at the edges. "I have told the council what you are to me," he said. "I will answer their petition tomorrow, and it will be the last petition of this kind. But I need you to know that what I said in there was not a strategy. It was not positioning. It was—" "I know what it was," she said. He was quiet. "Come in," she said. He did. They sat in the 2 wooden chairs in the healer's room, not touching except where his hand covered hers on the arm of the chair, the same way it had 4 days ago, and they talked until the sky outside the high windows shifted from black to the deep blue of near morning. She told him about Ashford and about her mother, and about the first time she had channeled the healing magic, and the woman's face she had healed, and the fear she had felt afterward. Not fear of her own power, but fear of being seen to have it. He told her about the throne, and about 11 years of having everything and being alone inside all of it, and about the bond, what it had felt like the day she arrived, the specific quality of a shift so fundamental it could not be undone. She listened to him the way she listened to patients, fully, without waiting for her turn to speak, without preparing her response, just hearing him. He did the same for her. At the 4th hour, when the sky was shifting toward the first gray of dawn, he said, "I cannot undo what I am. The council, the weight of it. What I will ask of you, if you stay, is not a simple thing." "I know," she said. "You will be challenged again. Not just Lord Thorne." "I know. And still—" "I told you," she said, "that I stay when things matter." She looked at him in the gray light of the almost morning. "You matter. This matters. I'm choosing it with all the weight it carries. Not because the moon chose it first, because I am choosing it now." The bond between them resonated like 2 halves of something ancient finally aligned. He lifted her hand from the arm of the chair, slowly, and he pressed his forehead to the back of it. Not a claiming, not a declaration, just a gesture of pure, unguarded feeling from a man who had spent 11 years learning not to have any of those in public, and was learning, slowly, in private, that they were still possible. She let him. Dawn came through the high, narrow windows in shades of rose and gold, and the bond hummed between them steadily, and she thought that this was what it was. Not the fire of the first recognition, not the pull that had dragged her back through the dark, not the lightning and the lock. This, the gray gold light, and his forehead against her hand, and the choice made clearly and without flinching. 2 people, deciding. Every morning, the bond would hum like this. Every morning, Lord Thorne and those like him would have their objections and their petitions and their carefully manufactured fear. Every morning, the palace would be cold and political, and full of people who considered a common-blooded village healer from Ashford to be a problem to be solved. every morning she would be here anyway. Not because she had to be, not because the bond said she must, because she had ridden back through the dark for this, because she had stood in the entrance hall with her bag over her shoulder and her cedar box in both hands and told the guard to send a message, and he had come down the stairs 2 at a time, gold eyes finding her from across 40 feet of black marble. Because when she had asked him if he had agreed to Lord Thorne's decision, he had said simply, no, because she was a healer, and she knew broken things when she saw them, and she knew things that were whole, and she knew the difference between a man performing safety and a man who, at the 3rd hour before sunrise, had knocked quietly on a door in the dark and waited for her to decide. She looked at him in the rose-gold light. "You're going to have to address the council in 2 hours," she said. "I know. You should probably sleep." "I should," he agreed, without moving. She looked at his face, the sharp features and the dark stubble and the gold eyes with the dawn in them, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was the most alone person she had ever seen, and that this was not perhaps something that needed to remain true. "Stay until it's fully light," she said. He did not say anything. He stayed. The bond settled around them like something that had finally found its proper shape, and the rose and gold of the morning came through the windows of the healer's room and laid itself across the black marble floor in long, warm lines, and outside, somewhere in the palace gardens, the moonflowers that bloomed in the dark were folding themselves closed against the coming day, and the Council of 7 was waking to its petitions and its machinations, and somewhere Lord Thorne was rehearsing arguments he would not win, and none of it touched the quiet of this room. Not yet. Not yet. It would. She knew it would. This was not the end of anything. It was, if anything, the very beginning of a long and difficult and probably occasionally infuriating thing. There would be more councils and more petitions and more men who looked at her the way Lord Thorne had looked at her, and more moments where she would have to decide, again, whether to leave or stay. She would stay, not because of the bond, though it hummed warm and steady in her chest, not because of the morning light, though it was beautiful, not because she was afraid to go, because she was not afraid of anything she could not fix. And this, she thought, looking at him clearly, was not something she wanted to fix. She wanted to build it. She was, after all, not most people. She had ridden back through the dark to say so, and he had knocked, and that, she thought, was exactly enough to start with.